So I recently read a pretty good book called How Civil Wars Start by Barbara Walter. So the book is exactly what its title says it is. The author is trying to explain what the big factors are that lead to civil wars around the world, and also trying to look at ways that we can hopefully prevent civil wars from happening in future. The author has worked for a number of organizations that study political violence and civil war, and she's linked to a bunch of think tanks. So in terms of her research, she's found that civil wars are most likely to occur in a country which is an anocracy. So Walter defines an anocracy as basically a mix of democratic and authoritarian. An anocracy is a country that is, somewhere between an authoritarian dictatorship and a democracy. In an anocracy, there is some power for the ordinary people. It does have some democratic elements, but then usually they will have a really powerful president or head of state who has authoritarian powers and not enough checks and balances and restrictions on the power of the head of state. So yeah, in a nutshell, anocracy is somewhere between dictatorship and democracy. So the author and one of the databases she has collaborated with use something that they call the Polity Score, which is basically a way of giving a score to a country in terms of how much of a dictatorship it is or how democratic it is. So it's a score that ranges from -10 to +10. So -10 means the most autocratic and the least democratic, and +10 means the most democratic. So according to that database, they would rank the top countries in the world that are the most democratic. The countries with a score of +10 include countries like Norway, New Zealand, and Denmark. And then the absolute worst countries with the least democracy, they give a score of -10, and some countries that have that -10 score are North Korea and Saudi Arabia. So what's interesting is that, according to this database, up until fairly recently, the USA scored very high, like a 7 or 8 on this list. But currently the Polity Score for the USA has been dropped to a +5, which actually does technically make it one of these anocracies, at least according to the Polity Score's definition. So basically the Polity Score says any country which gets a score between -5 and +5 is one of these anocracies, somewhere between dictatorship and democracy, and they recently gave America a +5 score, which is just within the danger zone of being an anocracy. Another example of an anocracy is Turkey, which before 2017 was mostly democratic, but in 2017 legislation was passed that greatly expanded the power of Erdogan, the head of state, which made the country less of a democracy and put it into the anocracy zone. So Walter's research indicates that anocracies are the most likely countries to have civil wars. Okay, so why exactly would it be that these countries that are somewhere between dictatorship and democracy have the most civil wars? Okay, one of the explanations that the author puts forward is that these anocracies are not democratic enough to please all the citizens, but they're also not strong and authoritarian enough to totally repress the citizens. So basically, there's a lot of people who are very upset with the government and the way the country's being run, and the government is not enough of a dictatorship to be able to silence those people and stop them from rising up. So kind of it exists in this very fragile, dangerous middle zone. And also the authors point out that there have been many times throughout history where a country actually descends into civil war after it starts becoming more democratic rather than less democratic, which is quite interesting. So another factor that the book raises as one of the driving forces for civil wars is the presence of really strong factions. So for them, they define a faction as a political group based on an inflexible identity marker, like religion or ethnicity. An example of a country with major factions would have been Rwanda in the 1990s, when there was massive violence between the Hutus and the Tutsis. Often in these countries where there are these major religious or ethnic divisions between people, you get certain politicians who will actually try to make the divisions between people worse for their own political gain. And the authors call these people ethnic entrepreneurs. So you can see why a politician or this kind of leader might want to make people more tribalistic and try to make people feel more strongly about their ethnicity or religion, because if your supporters are based on a certain ethnicity or belief system instead of their political views or their support for a certain set of policies, it means that there's nowhere for these people to go, if you know what I'm saying. Basically, if the conflict is between people with different ideas about policy, you know, you might have a case of another politician steal some of your voters because they convince the voters that their policies are better. But if people are divided by their ethnicity, you know, people can't change their ethnicity. If the conflict is between Hutus and Tutsis, someone can't just become a Tutsi if they're a Hutu. I probably explained that very badly, but I'm sure you get the point. Okay, another interesting factor that Barbara Walter brings up as one of the catalysts for civil wars is people feeling like they've lost status. People are really attuned to losses. I mean, certain psychological experiments have shown that people, you know, they feel much more of an emotional reaction if they lose $100 than if they gain $100. And Barbara Walter says it's the same with status. That if you have a certain group of people in a country who feel like they are losing status or political power, that is often one of the catalysts for getting those people energized and getting them to engage in extremism or political violence. Yet another factor that Walters lists is hopelessness. That very often when something happens which causes the people to lose hope that there's going to be any actual political changes, it's that kind of thing that can make people turn to violence. If they feel like they can no longer achieve anything by voting or protesting or taking part in the political system, then, you know, it makes sense that in that situation, people would say, well, I have no other option. I'm going to just turn to violence and try to get my way by force. Okay, and then yet another factor which Walter brings up, which quite a few people have been talking about in different ways over the last few years, is social media. Walter claims that in recent years, social media has been a big driving factor in causing violence and civil war. She thinks that social media fans the flames of factionalism and civil wars. Okay, she says this is because on social media, information easily goes viral and can reach a lot of people, and also just the way that most of the social media platforms are designed, they reward outrageous and extreme content. And of course, social media is a great place where false information can flourish and spread very far. It puts many people in contact with each other who normally wouldn't be in contact. And she cites some examples, like in recent years in Myanmar, there's been a lot of ethnic violence perpetrated against the Rohingya Muslim minority in the country. And Walter presents evidence basically showing how a lot of this very hateful rhetoric against the Rohingya was spread on social media, and that social media was used to organize a lot of the violence and to basically stoke people's anger and hatred of the Rohingya. Basically what Walter is saying is that civil wars are most likely to happen in a country which is an anocracy dominated by factions, often ethnic factions, where some of these factions feel like they're losing status and where these factions feel like they've lost hope. Like those are some of the key ingredients that lead to civil wars. Walter is also quite pessimistic about the future of the United States in this regard. She thinks that it's possible that in the next few years there will be some kind of civil war type conflict. She's certainly not the only one who thinks that. I'm not sure if I'm convinced. I mean, I certainly don't think there will be a full-on civil war in America anytime soon, although it currently seems like there's a bit of a cultural civil war, a cold civil war that is occurring. Barbara Walter also doesn't say that she believes that a full-scale civil war is going to break out in America, but she does think that there's going to be more political violence, like attacks on government buildings, attacks on government officials and politicians, and things like that. yeah, it's interesting to see how concerned she is about that. I know some other journalists and YouTubers have also spoken about that topic. So then all of this raises the question of, what can be done to prevent civil wars? So unfortunately, Walter says, we don't really have that many concrete answers to that question. One thing she says is that good leaders can play a really important role in preventing civil war. The example she gives is of South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994. Basically, she praises the decisions made by Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk to move the country to democracy without wide-scale violence. Okay, Walter also says that another way to reduce the chances of civil war is to just improve the quality of government, like working on things like checks and balances and restraints on the president's power or the head of state's power. And she says also when government is more transparent and people have more participation in the political system, that generally leads to less violence, which also just makes a lot of sense. Walter says that governments can also improve law enforcement so that people feel more safe, and that also they then trust the government more and see the government as more legitimate because they feel like the government is actually protecting them and is actually helping them. So basically, Walter says that governments have to try really hard to make sure that people feel that the system is working and that it's in their interest to play by the rules of the system, rather than turning to extremism or violence or saying, I want to just tear down this whole system because the system is clearly not working for me. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting book. I would recommend that you read it. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, and Walter does go into really good depth on examples of civil wars, especially some in recent years around the world, to sort of back up her claims. Yeah, so that's that. If you have any thoughts about the topic, please let me know in the comments. Or if you've read any good articles or good books on these sorts of topics, I'd be really curious to check them out. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.